World History Discussions, Chapter 7, Part 5. So we've talked about the peak of the Achaemenid Persian Empire under Darius between 521 and 486 BCE, but his successor Xerxes, who was in power from 486 to 465 BCE, was less successful on the cultural tolerance of subject people. Places like Mesopotamia and Egypt, where the subject people had a long, sophisticated cultural history of their own, which we studied in chapters 2 and 3, they became weary of Persian rule and they often rebelled. These rebellions were put down harshly, which led to even more resistance among subject people. But the most resistive group were the ethnic Greeks in Anatolia, especially on the Aegean coast of West Anatolia, interestingly enough, in what used to be the Kingdom of Lydia, although that has nothing to do with this particular story. But in 500 BCE, still in Darius's reign, these Ionian cities rebelled or expelled or executed their governors and claimed their independence, which led to 21 years of the Persian Wars, which we'll talk even more about in Chapter 10 on ancient Greece, but they lasted from 500 to 479 BCE. And basically, like the Americans fighting the British Empire over 2,000 years later, the Greeks would win these wars despite fighting the biggest empire in the world. And although Persia was much larger and much more powerful than these disunited Greek city-states, again, we're going to study them in Chapter 10, and I'm pumped, the Persian army had to contend with long and fragile supply lines and a hostile environment, much like the British fighting in the American colonies in the 1770s and 1780s. They were a long way from home, and the Greeks knew the land, which the Persians did not. That's what happens when you try to overextend yourself as an empire. This is one kind of theme in history that's going to play out over and over again. But anyway, in 490 BCE, the Persians were routed by the Greeks at the Battle of Marathon. 10 years later, in 480 BCE, Xerxes sent another expedition out to peninsular Greece. But 18 months later, by 479 BCE, they too had been defeated both on land at Thermopylae and at sea at the Battle of Salamis. And we'll talk again more about these wars in detail in Chapter 10. But for the next 150 years, the Persians fought sporadically with Greek city-states, but the Greek city-states were too small and disunited to really pose a serious threat to Persia, and the Persians were too busy putting rebellions down elsewhere to expand into Greece. However, this would all change in 334 BCE when Alexander of Macedon, or Alexander the Great, would invade Persia. We're going to talk about him a lot more in Chapter 10 as well when we get to the Greeks. But Alexander the Great invaded Persia with 48,000 men, which was actually much smaller than the Persian army in numbers. However, the Macedonians carried heavier arms and had more sophisticated military tactics than their opponents. And over the next 3 years, Alexander sliced through the Persian Empire with ease, dealing them defeat after defeat. And finally, in 331 BCE, at the Battle of Gaugamela, the Persians were defeated. And by 330 BCE, the empire had completely dissolved, a little over 200 years after its rise. After this, Alexander marched into Persepolis, and he looted the treasury, paid respects to the tomb of Cyrus in Passagardi, and then proclaimed himself as the heir to the Achaemenid rulers. In fact, this is pretty important because, for example, we were talking about the Persians and their tolerance. Like when Cyrus took over Babylon 200 years earlier, he claimed to be a Babylonian king, a legit ruler. I'm pretty sure the Persians in Egypt probably claimed to be pharaohs, for example. So pretty much they claimed to be representing whatever lands they were invading. And similarly, when Alexander invaded Persia, he claimed to be Persian and a legit descendant of the Achaemenid rulers, even though obviously he was Macedonian and not Persian. But anyway, after a brief celebration, he and his forces lit a fire, perhaps intentionally, and destroyed Persepolis. Archaeologists in the 18th century found 3 feet worth of ash and charcoal. And then Alexander the Great died in 323 BCE, but his Seleucid dynasty continued, and that's next.